In the final weeks of the war, the world of the Görings collapsed with brutal speed. On April 28, 1945, Hermann Göring ordered the destruction of Karinhal, his trophy residence in the Schorfheide, to prevent the Red Army from capturing it intact. The demolition erased the most visible symbol of his power, but it did not erase what that place had concentrated: privileges, works of art, state gifts, and above all, goods tied to the looting carried out by the Third Reich in occupied Europe. Emmy Göring and her daughter Edda became trapped in the same desperate retreat experienced by the Nazi leadership. The network of Alpine shelters and requisitioned houses still operated by inertia, but there was no longer a Reich capable of protecting them. When Göring attempted to save himself from the Soviet end and sought to surrender to the Americans, he changed the fate of his family without asking for their permission. On May 9, 1945, US troops took him into custody near Rastatt, Austria. From that moment on, Emmy ceased to be the wife of the Reichsmarschall and became a figure under interrogation and control, a potential witness and an administrative problem. The immediate post-war period did not resemble a single prison, but rather a system of confinements and transfers. On May 21, 1945, US authorities interned Emmy and Edda at the Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, a site that functioned as a detention center for individuals from the Nazi environment. In that hotel, nicknamed by the Allies as Camp Ashken or Garbage Camp, the silence of the hallways, military control, and the fixed idea that, although the war had ended, the names of that elite still held value as evidence, all mixed together. Edda, still a child, went from an upbringing surrounded by servants and ceremonies to a routine of surveillance, unfamiliar rules, and minimal baggage. Meanwhile, the Allies began the material disarmament of the Göring Empire. Jewels, furs, accounts, and above all, art entered a circuit of inventories and confiscations. The point was not just to punish, it was to reconstruct the map of a plunder. Göring's collection became a landmark case because it contained works confiscated from Jewish collectors and persecuted families, and because Göring himself acted as a privileged buyer within the Nazi plundering apparatus. Allied researchers traced deposits in Bavaria and Austria and dismantled the collection for restitution, custody, or evidence. When the International Military Tribunal opened in Nuremberg in November 1945, Göring took center stage. His presence and strategy marked the atmosphere of the trial. He spoke, argued, defended himself, and sought to present himself as a statesman. This exposure turned him into the public face of the defeated Nazism, and this same visibility dragged his family into constant scrutiny. Any benefit from the past became a stain. Any object kept became suspicious. Any explanation sounded like a cover-up. On October 1, 1946, the sentence arrived. The tribunal declared him guilty and sentenced him to death. For Emmy and Edda, the verdict did not close the story. It opened it. The conviction triggered a harder, longer process because it was no longer about Göring's personal fate, but about what remained of the Göring system in goods, networks, and memory. On the eve of his execution, October 15, 1946, Göring committed suicide with a cyanide capsule. The news not only struck personally, but also froze any possibility of negotiation and hardened the administrative logic that followed. The life of Emmy and Edda Göring after World War II. Starting in 1947, Emmy Göring's case became trapped in the most delicate mechanism of post-war Germany, denazification. Her name did not pass like that of any ordinary widow. The authorities considered her a public figure of the regime due to her constant presence at ceremonies, cultural events, and diplomatic functions. This visibility weighed more than any argument of political distance. In this new climate, Emmy was no longer debating prestige. She was debating classification, sanctions, and survival. Every process she attempted to initiate collided with the same wall. The state and occupation authorities interpreted that her previous life was not neutral and that her benefits had not belonged to the private order, but a sinister privilege derived from a criminal system. In 1947, a denazification court in the Munich area formally summoned her and opened a file centered around one simple question: what degree of social and moral responsibility did someone have who, without holding an official position, functioned as a recognizable face of power? The prosecution presented photographs, testimonies, and records of her participation in state-sponsored cultural organizations. With this material, they argued that Emmy not only accompanied Nazism but helped present the regime as normal, making it presentable at events, theaters, and meetings, as if public appearance could compensate for political violence. Emmy responded with a repeated defense. She claimed that she acted as a private person, did not make government decisions, and was pushed into a role she never sought. The verdict arrived in March 1948 and struck her at the exact point where denazification punished most severely: civil status. The court classified her as belastet, meaning a major offender within the system. This label stripped her of the little she could still claim. She lost residual property rights, her demands for household goods retained by the authorities were blocked, and she received prohibitions that affected her daily life: restrictions to work in public sectors, limitations on participation in cultural institutions, and obstacles to presenting herself in spaces where her last name could become a political platform or a way to revive Nazism. Additionally, the verdict closed the door to pensions linked to Hermann Göring's former state positions because the ruling did not distinguish between wife and beneficiary. It placed her within the structure of privileges that the new state had to dismantle. Emmy appealed almost immediately. She insisted that the court exaggerated her political involvement and emphasized her lack of formal power within the government. Her lawyers supported the argument with personal elements such as family responsibilities, ignorance of high-level decisions, and withdrawal from public life in the final years of the regime. Over time, these appeals softened some practical restrictions, especially those related to movement and employment. However, the central sanctions remained as a legal and moral mark, following her for decades as an identity sentence. For the post-war state, she was not a mere bystander. From the late 1940s, Emmy faced a problem less ideological and more direct: how to live and sustain herself daily. She attempted to obtain compensation and claimed pension rights, but these requests progressed slowly or stalled due to the political burden of the case. She did not recover a comfortable fortune, did not rebuild a protective network, and relied on old connections to support herself. She settled in Munich and led a life much more modest than the one the world associated with the Görings. Her economic situation became wrapped in contradictory accounts. Some stories portrayed her as being on the verge of poverty, while others described her as someone who managed to reach economic stability but without luxury. The constant was something else. Emmy never regained control of the public narrative, and in every conversation about her life, the past returned as an accusation. In the 1960s, when West Germany was already showing material reconstruction and a part of society sought to close the subject, Emmy chose to speak again. In 1967, she published her autobiography, An der Seite meines Mannes. With that book, she tried to set a definitive version of her personal story, and above all of Hermann Göring. She did not write as a repentant witness, but as a defender of her husband. She described him as a loving husband and an unjustly demonized figure, maintaining a loyalty that clashed with historical records. In 1972, the English edition, My Life with Göring, appeared, expanding the scope of this attempt at domestic rehabilitation. Emmy did not correct this approach with the years. She upheld it as a stance and as refuge, even when the world had already treated the Nazi legacy as irrefutable evidence. In her later years, her health deteriorated and her circle shrank. On June 8, 1973, she died in Munich, leaving her daughter as the sole guardian of a family memory that could never again be separated from the moral judgment of history. Edda remained by her side until the end, and this closure consolidated the last trait that defined Emmy after 1947: persistence, not to rebuild power, but to resist the symbolic collapse of her last name. Edda, for her part, entered 1947 with a problem that no court could solve: how to grow under a name that functioned as a social sentence. That year, while her mother's case was progressing, the Allied authorities briefly debated what to do with her in terms of guardianship. The plan to place her under external guardianship appeared as a possibility, but eventually, the option of returning her to Emmy under supervision prevailed when her legal situation was clarified. This decision avoided a formal separation, but made clear that the Göring name turned a minor into an administrative matter. After the 1948 ruling, Edda returned with her mother to Munich and began a life that resembled more a silent reconstruction than a new beginning. She attended local schools, lived in modest rooms, and learned almost without choice to coexist with glances and rumors. The last name haunted her as a public label, but she did not let it go. Instead of breaking with it, she held on to it as part of her identity, even when that gesture isolated her. During the 1950s, Edda sought normalcy in a Germany that had grown accustomed to coexisting with the past without fully naming it. While the country focused on recovering work, consumption, and stability, she moved discreetly through lanes, education, employment, and private life without major exposure. When she reached adulthood, she began law studies at the University of Munich. She worked for a time as an employee or assistant in the legal field, and then moved to a more stable and less visible job, performing technical tasks in a hospital laboratory as a medical technical assistant. She held that job for decades. She never married and had no children, and this continuity reinforced an image of a closed life, almost defensive, as if any social expansion could mean confronting the weight of her last name. In the 1970s, Edda once again brushed against environments where the past circulated without shame. She became involved for a time with journalist Gerd Heidemann, and that closeness placed her in a circuit where the Third Reich did not function as a warning, but as a constant conversation. In these gatherings, memory mixed with nostalgia, fetishism, and networks of former regime members. Edda's presence in that world did not imply open militancy, but did expose her main inclination. She did not accept the moral verdict on her father as part of her biography. This stance hardened with the years. In sporadic interviews during the 1990s and 2000s, Edda defended Hermann Göring with a persistent formula. She described him as a loving father and avoided confronting the crimes associated with his historical role. When asked about responsibility, she responded from intimate memory, not from documents. She claimed to remember a protective father and stated that the world distorted his image. This response even separated her from parts of her extended family and other German generations who, over time, chose a more critical relationship with the Nazi legacy. In her later years, Edda lived discreetly, spent some time in Schwaz, Austria, and then returned to Munich. She died on December 21, 2018. Obituaries highlighted the same idea. She maintained loyalty until the end, and that fidelity turned her into an uncomfortable symbol because it showed that the military defeat of 1945 did not guarantee an intimate defeat in all Nazi families. The contrast even appeared within the Göring family tree itself. Bettina Göring, Hermann's great niece, born after the war, took an opposite path. In public interviews, she rejected the family narrative, spoke of the psychological weight of the last name, and shared an extreme decision aimed at cutting the lineage. She and her brother chose to undergo voluntary sterilization to end the line and prevent a new generation from inheriting what she described as Göring's shadow. The Himmler family after the fall of the Reich and the denazification of Germany. Just as with the Göring family, another Nazi leader left a sinister legacy in his bloodline. In May 1945, after the collapse of the Reich, Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and one of the pillars of the Nazi repressive system, tried to escape with a false identity and a small group of assistants. He disguised himself as a sergeant and moved through northern Germany, looking for a way out in the chaos. On May 22, 1945, a British checkpoint near Bremervörde stopped him and separated him from the flow of fugitives. In the following hours, he was transferred to interrogation facilities in the Nuremberg area, and on May 23, during a medical examination under British custody, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule and died within minutes. He was buried in an unmarked grave near Nuremberg. The exact location was deliberately kept vague. This sudden end did not close the story of the Himmler family. It opened it. Margaret Himmler and her daughter Gudrun no longer had a center to return to, because the center no longer existed. In the final phase of the war, both moved south as the Allied lines advanced and the old security circuits disintegrated. In May 1945, US troops arrested them in the Bolzano area of Italy and placed them under custody as direct relatives of a persecuted leader. From that moment on, Margareta and Gudrun's lives became a sequence of transfers. They were moved between internment camps in Italy, then France, and finally Germany, always under the same logic: prevent escapes, extract information, and keep them available as potential witnesses. The interrogations sought two things: to track residual networks such as contacts, deposits, or escape routes, and to locate hidden documents or money. In Allied reports, Margaret appeared as a reserved woman who denied knowledge of her husband's official matters and presented herself as a wife and mother. This argument served her in part, as the interrogators concluded that she did not control operational structures, but it did not help her recover dignity, property, or normalcy. For Gudrun, the blow had a different psychological component. In 1945, she was already a teenager and carried with her a bond of idolization that Himmler had cultivated over the years. He called her Puppy, showed her off during visits, and made her part of a carefully constructed domestic image. In the camps, this image was shattered head-on. For the Allies, Gudrun was no longer the daughter of the Reichsführer. She was a potential source of information and a symbol of collapse. In later testimonies, she described that period as the hardest of her life and maintained the idea of family punishment, as if the father's guilt had been transferred to the daughter. In 1945 and 1946, the major trials against the Nazi leadership dominated the scene, and Nuremberg became a machine of judicial truth and political propaganda. Margaret and Gudrun did not face charges in the International Military Tribunal, but they were brought in to testify during the proceedings, and then they were kept detained in internment facilities in Germany, including the Flak Kaserne in Ludwigsburg. This period extended the uncertainty. Each public hearing that exposed the Nazi criminal apparatus also hardened the climate surrounding the family members. In November 1946, when the main cycle of Nuremberg had already ended, the authorities released them from internment. The release did not mean returning home, as their home was under dispute and confiscation. Their accounts were frozen, and their last name had become a social mark. In this first return, both sought refuge at Bethel, a Protestant institution in Bielefeld. The decision sparked public controversy. Housing Himmler's widow and daughter felt, to many, like a moral provocation in a Germany still counting its dead and rebuilding its ruins. Bethel justified the gesture with a Christian principle of forgiveness, but the debate revealed something key. In the post-war period, the fall of the Reich was also fought on a symbolic level, and the Himmler family found itself at the center of this battle. Then came the second phase of punishment, the administrative one. In Germany, denazification was not only carried out by criminal courts, it was also carried out by commissions that classified millions of people based on their proximity to the regime. The Allies distributed massive questionnaires called Fragebögen and pushed local processes that, with uneven results, tried to separate the guilty, the beneficiaries, and the collaborators. This system turned civilian life into a permanent filter. Margareta entered this filter through two routes: through her marriage and through her own involvement in organizations linked to the Nazi state, especially in the welfare and health sectors. In 1948, a denazification court in Bielefeld classified her as a minor offender, but she appealed and sought to reduce the weight of the classification. On March 19, 1951, the process left her in Category 4 as Mitläuferin, meaning follower or sympathizer, a label that avoided attributing direct crimes to her, but confirmed that she benefited from and supported the Nazi system. That closure did not last. In the background, a material issue reopened the wound: the ownership of the family home in Gmünd and the debate about which part of the wealth could be considered as gains from the regime. A new procedure was activated politically in Bavaria and linked to the British occupation zone. On January 15, 1953, in a final hearing in Munich, she was reclassified in Category 2 as Belastet, meaning a beneficiary, activist, or opportunist of the system. The sanction did not sound spectacular in terms of imprisonment, but it hit where it hurt in post-war Germany. She was imposed with 30 days of punitive labor, and her pension rights and the right to vote were taken away. Margareta interpreted this decision as personal humiliation and wrote complaints in which she described herself as a victim of Allied hatred. The record, however, treated her as part of a circle that lived off power and did not distance itself from it. Gudrun underwent denazification from a different angle. She was not judged as an adult, but the system pushed her into social clandestinity. In the following years, she sought work and tried using alternative last names to avoid attention, but the environment always recognized her. What mattered was not her employment, it was her identity. While West Germany was rebuilding institutions and seeking stability, Gudrun maintained a rigid loyalty to her father and rejected the moral consensus that was imposed around his figure. This fidelity later led her to circles of former SS members and networks providing help to ex-members, a silent bridge between the defeated past and the political margins of the post-war era, the life of Gudrun Himmler and the rest of the Himmler family after the Second World War. Gudrun Himmler emerged from Allied internment without a previous life to return to. Instead of breaking with her past, Gudrun chose the opposite. She protected it, defended it, and turned it into her identity. In the years immediately following the war, Gudrun moved through a country that was reorganizing its public morality with courts, files, and silences. For her, denazification classified, sanctioned, and degraded, yet the social fabric still held some remnants of loyalty to the defeated Reich. Gudrun decided that she must find those remnants of resistance, and she did so with ease. In 1951, she married Wolf-Dieter Berwitz, a man linked to the far-right milieu and associated with the NPD party in Bavaria. The couple settled near Munich and had 2 children. On the outside, she fit into a typical mold, a wife and mother with a suburban routine. On the inside, she maintained an unwavering loyalty to Himmler and what he represented. This double life became more visible when she entered the bureaucratic heart of West Germany. Between 1961 and 1963, Gudrun worked as a secretary at the Pullach headquarters of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, or BND, the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Federal Republic. To do so, she used an assumed name. Decades later, the BND itself acknowledged her hiring and admitted that it had employed the daughter of Heinrich Himmler during the Cold War. This admission, spread by the press, opened an uncomfortable debate, whether the case reflected the continuity of networks and institutional tolerance for compromised biographies, or whether it simply showed the pragmatic normalization of a society that sought personnel with contacts and an anti-communist past. In any interpretation, the fact was undeniable. Gudrun Berwitz worked there for 2 years, during a period when the state apparatus still absorbed figures and environments connected to the old regime. After this experience, Gudrun strengthened her ties with the world of SS veterans and relatives who refused to accept defeat as a moral break. In 1951, a key structure was publicly consolidated. Stille Hilfe für Kriegsgefangene und Internierte, the silent help for prisoners of war and interned persons. The organization presented itself as humanitarian aid for prisoners and internees, but it accumulated criticism for supporting former SS members, facilitating legal defenses, and maintaining solidarity networks with convicted criminals or fugitives. Its initial push was attributed to aristocratic and conservative figures, and over the years it became linked to the ecosystem of apologists and revisionists. Gudrun was not just a sympathizer. Several journalistic investigations described her as an iconic presence in that environment, someone who wrote letters, raised funds, and upheld the spirit of camaraderie when the rest of the country sought to forget. The way Gudrun operated was almost never strident. She avoided cameras, rejected interviews, and chose discretion as her armor. However, her image circulated in photos of private meetings, surrounded by elderly men still treating each other as officers. These images were striking because they didn't show remorse. They showed audacious impudence. In specific statements, she denied that her father embodied the evil described in the archives and maintained a domestic version that he was a great man and someone who did good things for Germany. Such phrases were not just sentimental defense. They sought to function as an accusation against the historical narrative because Gudrun insisted that the victors distorted the past. The true scope of Stille Hilfe became a recurring topic because the organization was associated in various accounts with material or legal support for persecuted figures. In this constellation, names like Klaus Barbie and other former SS or police members were mentioned. The key point was not a secret command of the post-war period, but an assistance network that operated in grey areas, facilitating donations, lawyers, contacts, family support, and in some cases moral backing for fugitives. In Germany, this ambiguity complicated the state's response. Prosecuting a charitable organization was difficult, but ignoring it implied tolerating an active memory of Nazism. Gudrun remained within that margin for decades without facing formal charges for her activities, thus turning her life into a symbol. The daughter of the Reichsführer who lived as if the defeat had never been a definitive judgment. On May 24, 2018, Gudrun Berwitz died in Munich at the age of 88. Her death triggered an almost inevitable media closure. Obituaries and articles once again remembered that she never repudiated her father. The BND data and the image of Stille Hilfe resurfaced, as if her biography encapsulated the post-war German dilemma. Rapid institutional reconstruction, delayed memory, and persistent pockets of radical loyalty. While Gudrun defended the legacy, the rest of the Himmler family tree fragmented into very different destinies. Margareta Himmler, her mother, survived internment and denazification, but never regained prestige or stability. In the post-war years, she lived in her daughter's orbit and spent her final days in Munich. She died on August 25, 1967. Her trajectory left a trail of denial and resentment, reinforcing the domestic climate that sustained Gudrun, that of a family that felt punished for being the wrong Himmler, not for what that Himmler did. In the previous generation, Heinrich's siblings offered a useful contrast. Ernst Hermann Himmler, the youngest, never lived through the post-war period. He died on May 2, 1945, during the final battles in Berlin, enrolled in the Volkssturm during the collapse of the Third Reich. His death left a broken branch, but his surname lived on through his descendants. Gebhard Ludwig Himmler, the oldest, did navigate the New World. Allied authorities detained him, interned him, and released him in 1948. After his release, he rebuilt a low-profile life in Munich, worked in technical and industrial fields, and later became involved in a German-Afghan cultural office that provided advisory services and internships for students. He died in Munich on June 22, 1982. His case showed another family strategy, surviving without proclamations, avoiding the spotlight, and letting time bury the connection to the most infamous brother. The most significant break came from a later generation. Katrin Himmler, born in 1967 into Ernst's branch, chose what Gudrun rejected, to investigate and speak. She trained as a political scientist and in 2005 published a book tracing the Himmler brothers as a German family history with a central question. How did a middle-class family produce, sustain, or tolerate the trajectory that led to the Reichsführer SS? This decision did not seek to clean the name, but to understand the social and domestic mechanism that made the unthinkable possible. This generational shift became even more visible in 2014, when a collection of letters, photographs, and diaries related to Himmler and his family environment found in Israel and authenticated by the Bundesarchiv was revealed. The material shows a chilling coexistence between the domestic and the criminal, marital affection, everyday matters, and surrounding it, the genocidal machinery. For many readers, the impact wasn't in the new known evil, but in the normalcy with which the perpetrator wrote from his desk. In that mirror, the Himmler family was exposed in two directions, as recipients of that intimacy and as heirs of the moral burden. Gudrun chose to guard the myth. Katrin chose to break it with documents.